Gray,
Kristen Dumais,
Jemar Tisby,
Russell Moore. Why are you still a Christian?
This is Phil. The last 5 or 6 years have been rough for many thoughtful, faithful Christians. The embrace of Trump and Trumpism, the rise of ethnic nationalism and xenophobia, conspiracy theories and abuse scandals have rocked the church. Many have walked away in disgust. Some have spoken out and paid the price, and yet rather than walking away have remained committed to Christ and His church. We wanted to sit down with a few of those who have cried out like voices in the wilderness, who've been attacked by the church they love and yet still remain. We wanted to ask a simple question. Why are you still a Christian? Jemar Tisby is a professor of history at Simmons College of Kentucky in Louisville. He's the author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Color of Compromise, The Truth About the Church's Complicity in Racism, and How to Fight Racism. Tisby's efforts to help the white church come to terms with its own racial history led to speaking invitations and conference appearances, and then a brutal backlash, as he became the face for many of the dangers of wokeism in the church. I sat down with Jemar Tisby to find out why, after all the attacks, he's still following Jesus. I'm here with Jemar Tisby. You may know him from prior appearances. He was on episodes 422 and 440, talking about his books, The Color of Compromise and How to Fight Racism. I first met Jemar in the, I think, summer of 2020 when the world was going crazy and we were talking about race. And there was a moment where it seemed like white evangelicalism was willing to listen. And then it passed. Yeah. You remember that? Remember
ever so quickly, yes. There were a couple of moments like that.
Okay, so let's back up, though. Jemar Tisby, did you grow up in the church?
Not really. So I went to Catholic schools, K through 8. So God talk was sort of all around. And in our house, we weren't practicing anything. We weren't going to church or doing much at all. But there was no hostility there. There was no opposition to it. It just wasn't a priority.
And did your family have any relationship with the black church? I mean, were your grandparents connected with churches?
You know, not a ton. Not really. So I think that was part of it. And then my parents moved around a few different times, and depending on where they were, they would go to church more regularly or not. But by the time I came along, that wasn't a habit.
Okay, so did that, and I think we probably talked about this years ago on one of these shows, but not everyone has time to go back to listen. At what point did your faith, did you own it? Did you find a faith and decide, not only am I going to embrace this faith, but I'm kind of going to center my life around it?
High school. A good friend of mine who's a friend to this day, we had freshman health class together, and he stuck out to me because he was assiduously honest about his homework, and he also didn't use swear words. He never cursed, it stood out to me for some reason at that age. And come to find out, he's a Christian. And eventually he invites me to this youth group, which I would come to know as a white evangelical youth group, sort of in the seeker-sensitive movement. But, you know, they had these little mini sermonettes. And along the way, at some point, it made sense to me. And I prayed the sinner's prayer and gave my life to Christ.
Okay. And you were, what?
Yeah, about 16,
15,
17.
16? Okay. And when did you decide, I actually want to make this a focus of, maybe what I do?
I was pretty serious. I was such a cool kid in high school that I was already dreaming of seminary.
Wow.
Yes, definitely. Wow. Most popular kid in class. Like one day I'm going to grow up and go to seminary. But so,
and where'd you go to seminary?
I went to Reformed Theological Seminary.
Okay, and
in
that's
Jackson, Mississippi.
Largely African American.
When I enrolled at RTS in Jackson, to my recollection, you could count on one hand the number of Black American students who were enrolled residential and full time. Okay. So, and that's in a city of Jackson, which is over 80% Black.
Yeah, right.
So it made no sense.
Yeah, right. So at some point, you decided that you were in these white evangelical spaces, you were going to start talking about race and inequity and racial justice. Did you think that was going to be problematic from the get-go?
Well, we started out by saying there seemed to be an opening. There seemed to be some receptivity. And that's what I felt like. People were talking about, remember, this is like in early 2010s. And so the multi-ethnic church movement is still pretty popular, which is novel even throughout U.S. history, because while there had been attempts here and there to bring people together in an ecclesiastical context, it hadn't gained traction like it had from, say, the 90s up to the early 2010s, when people were making an intentional effort. They would put this in like their mission statement and talk about it as in their church planting meetings. We're going to be multiracial, multi-ethnic congregation. And so all of that to me was saying, okay, there's an openness, a willingness to listen, and perhaps potential for progress. So that was the context in which I started talking about racial reconciliation. And I thought that we were on the same page on that, and came to find out we meant very different things.
Right. So you did a series of podcasts with the Pass the Mic podcast on stories you called Leave Loud stories. What's a Leave Loud story, and is it leaving the faith? Is it following Richard Dawkins into atheism? What were those?
So it starts with a quiet exodus, and that's based on a New York Times article by Campbell Robertson that it was, I think, 2018 or so. And he was getting stories of Black people who had quietly left their predominantly white evangelical churches, mainly for reasons of Trumpism and supporting Trump, as well as tepid stances on racial justice in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so a lot of the folks that I knew personally, we were doing that. There would be some sermon, some statement, some current event that would the light bulb would come on, and we would say, this is not the place for us anymore. And we would just kind of quietly make our exit. But this kept happening. And so finally, in conversation with two of my colleagues, Tyler Burns and Ali Henney, I mentioned, you know what, the time for a quiet exodus is over. We need to leave loud, by which I meant we need to leave those spaces, not leave the faith, not leave Christianity, not leave Christ, but we need to leave these spaces that had become, and many cases always were, racially toxic. And we need to tell our stories, to do two things. Number one, hold them accountable for their ethical issues of racism. And number two, to prevent further harm to people who, if they didn't know these stories, would enter into these spaces and perhaps be victimized in similar ways that we were.
Okay. So, I had you on the podcast a couple of times, talked about both your books. We had a few episodes about race. I did a few videos about race. At first, people said, yay, the creator of VeggieTales is woke. And then within about a month, people were saying, hey, the creator of VeggieTales is woke. Yes. And it was suddenly a pejorative. And then came to the season of CRT, where everyone was talking about critical race theory all the time. Your name became really closely associated with critical race theory, like you were, out there teaching graduate level courses.
A well-known scholar of CRT.
yeah. That you studied it at Reformed Theological Seminary, didn't you? In their CRT program.
As I was going to law school, yes. No.
Describe briefly for people the Grove City College incident.
So I didn't know about critical race theory until people were accusing me of promoting it. And then I had to look into it, like, what is this? And I went to Grove City College, which is a very conservative Christian school in Western Pennsylvania. I'll never forget the context. It was October 2020, a few weeks before the presidential election. This was heavy Trump supporting country, and I had never seen so many Trump signs in such a compact area. And I went into these spaces because generally I'll go if they invite me. If they will give me a hearing, I will do my best, which I did. I had a generally positive interaction while I was on campus. Some students asking, very clearly charged questions. They were coming from very conservative backgrounds, but, it was fine. Left, didn't think much more about it. A year later, so this is fall of 2021, there's a petition online that says save GCC, Grove City College, from CRT. And it lists a laundry list of issues that they say indicate that Grove City College is teaching critical race theory, or at least allowing it to spread. And I was one of the people that they cited as problematic. And they cited a chapel message that I gave, which is online to this day. And I guarantee you, it is gentle. It is what they could handle at this school. And nothing I said to most people would sound at all controversial, but they used this maybe 20-minute message as evidence of what they called mission drift. And it turned into this big thing. The reason why most people know about it is it went up to the level of the Board of Trustees, and they formed a subcommittee to investigate this CRT. And then they came up with a report, and I had a full page in the report that said it was a mistake, quote, a mistake to invite me to speak at chapel. And then the Board of Trustees, the full board, approved it. So that's when I went public and wrote an open letter to them.
Did any of that, did they say they were sorry and that they were wrong and that you're not CRT and that they were happy with your talk?
So one of the things that we got to realize, especially at the college and university level, Christian colleges and universities, the grass tops and the grassroots are very different. So the students I interacted with, the faculty and the staff, by and large, very agreeable. They're the ones who invited me. What we're talking about is the upper level administration, some alumni, and the Board of Trustees. When I went public with it, I got a lot of support from students and from some alumni. I got a couple of private messages from administrators who did not want to go on record as saying they had done anything wrong. And of course, there were faculty and staff who had invited me, who supported me. But at the Board of Trustees level, at the decision maker level, nothing. And here's the thing. You have so many Christian colleges and universities now who have staked their institutional survival on being branded as conservative, hyper conservative. And really, it's not about being conservative. It's about appearing not woke. It's about appearing not to promote critical. So they want to distance themselves as far as they can from that. And that's how they recruit more students. That's how they get more donor dollars. That's how they ensure their institutional longevity.
Yeah, you need to put a flag in your yard to say which side of the culture war you're on.
100%.
And even that you acknowledge that we're supposed to be fighting this culture war with your kids, and that we're on the right side. Trust us, we're on the right side. So there is I don't think they like the phrase virtue signaling, but there's quite a bit of virtue signaling happening in conservative white Christian institutions. Okay, so let's get a little more personal. This must have been kind of rough on you.
So by the time Grove City College came along, I was kind of used to this. Okay. So a few things had happened by then. One, I had been in the Presbyterian Church in America, which is a very conservative denomination with roots in Southern Presbyterianism. And by now we should know, if it's Southern in front of the name, that's because they were pro-slavery and they split off. And unfortunately, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. The root indicates the fruit. So we were still dealing with, this is the first time I really ever dealt with neo-Confederates, was in this denomination as they're trolling me when I'm writing something or speaking, and they're coming out on the internet, right? So that had happened. We're saying Black Lives Matter. And then some parts of the church are saying all lives matter or blue lives matter or you're being divisive. And then, of course, Trumpism has already occurred. And then my first book, The Color of Compromise, The Truth About the American Church's Complicity in Racism, that had come out in January 2019. So I had already become labeled with some folks. And then when the Grove City incident happened, I had already distanced myself from a lot of those circles. But again, still willing to go and speak if people are willing to listen.
Right. You were more of a guest missionary at that point. So you kind of distanced yourself from those white evangelical circles. Were you ever at the point of just saying, if this is what Christianity in America is, I don't think I can be a part of it?
No, it never crossed my mind.
Okay.
It was from the jump very clear that what we were dealing with was the progeny of what Frederick Douglass called slaveholder Christianity. And he contrasted that with the Christianity of Christ. And that was always very clear to me because what was happening was so unjust and it was so not Christ-like. And so it always felt to me like what I was dealing with was not a disappointing revelation about Christianity or Jesus, and more about people who were more committed to acquiring power and maintaining a racial status quo than they were about following Jesus. So I think part of that is being attached to Black Christians. And I cannot emphasize enough the different framing that happens in the Black church. I'm at a historically Black college now, Simmons College of Kentucky. It's faith-based. It was started by Black Baptist pastors right after the Civil War. And what our administrators are saying is that we need to teach our students social justice. We need to teach them social concern, which is not what you would get in many of these majority white conservative Christian higher ed institutions. So the framing is vastly different. The priorities are vastly different. And when I got exposed to that, I was like, okay, what I'm hearing from white evangelicals or conservative Christians in general is not the only way to think about the faith. And I just had this much wider perspective. Now, that's not to say that it wasn't difficult, because what was hard is these were relationships.
Yeah.
These were communities. This was betrayal. I'm still trying to heal from some of the very close relationships I had with people, some of the folks who I trusted, when it came down to supporting me vocally or in public, and they remained silent. It really was painful. And I had to reestablish myself with a new community of people who didn't see Jesus and justice as mutually exclusive, but mutually constitutive. And thankfully I have, but it's still painful.
Okay. So what have you learned about God in the last 5 years, 6 years?
To be a Christian means to be a Christ follower. And in the most difficult moments, I've had to remember this is all about Jesus. Whatever his followers do, whatever we have made of religion, we got to deal with this Jesus character. And that has been the most refreshing, the most sensitive, the most intimate time that I've had in my faith, is remembering that at the end of the day, our religion is not about a set of beliefs. It's not about acquiring certain kinds of power. It's about a relationship. And that's what I have. That's my one sermon everywhere I go, is remember that it's all about Jesus. And when we're discouraged, when we're frustrated, when we're in pain, when we feel that betrayal, we have to remember Jesus' words. Blessed are you when you are persecuted for righteousness' sake. And that he knows what it's like to be betrayed by his closest friends, his own disciples, to the point of death. There's nothing that we've experienced with any kind of trauma that Jesus can't come alongside us and have an understanding of. And that's what has kept me. That's why I'm still Christian. Jesus is why I'm still Christian.
That's a fantastic answer. Have you found where you are? Have you found a local body to be a part of? Do you belong somewhere?
No, I don't belong anywhere right now. I think sociologically speaking, I would be part of the nuns in the sense of nothing in particular. I'm still Christian. I'm still a Jesus follower. What I'm looking for is an ecclesiastical community that feels right. And to be quite honest, a lot of that hesitation is not because there aren't good churches around. It's because I'm still hurt. And it's still very hard to enter into the spaces and sing the songs and do the Bible studies when the last time you did it, it resulted in such a rupture of relationships. And the other impact, because I don't want people to at all think this is just a rosy, happy ending to the story. It's an ongoing saga. And one of the ongoing parts is it took me a long time to really start praying again. I would say only in the past 9 months or so did I start to feel the same kind of closeness in prayer that I once had. And it's still taking me, right to this day, a long time to read the Bible again. Because so many of the theological tools I got were in seminary or from people who demonstrated they were not at all invested in racial justice. And so it's a distrust of the teaching and the tools that I got from them. They're not all bad, but there's an emotional component to this that we've got to deal with.
This episode is being sponsored by AG1 by Athletic Greens. Some of you know that my dad is a doctor, and as I get older, he's always telling me to watch my weight and exercise regularly. But in the last few years, he's also been telling me to pay attention to my gut health. He's been persuaded by all the research saying that the biome of good bacteria that lives in our guts is critical to our long-term health. There's just one problem. I hate taking lots of pills and vitamins and supplements. And why do they always have to be so big? That's one of the reasons I was excited to try AG1 by Athletic Greens. AG1 is a foundational nutritional drink with 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food ingredients. I take it first thing in the morning before I've had my tea and before I jump into my morning routine of writing my daily devotional. And I'll be honest, it tasted way better than I expected. I've been doing it for a few weeks now, and I feel great knowing I'm supporting my health and not having to gag down a bunch of giant pills every morning. And that's why I've stuck with it, because AG1 is a super easy daily habit. So, if you're looking for a simpler and cost-effective supplement routine, check out AG1 by Athletic Greens. And right now, Athletic Greens is giving you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Go to athleticgreens.com/holypost. That's athleticgreens.com/holypost.
Yeah. Okay, so you can go back in time and sit down with 20-year-old Jemar and have a conversation. What would you tell yourself to try to prepare yourself for what was ahead?
I would say commit yourself to studying history. There is such a power in knowing where we've been and where we come from and how we got here. On both sides. One, you study the evil. You study the racism and white supremacy with which Christians have all too often been complicit. But on the other side, you get the people who resisted those things. My forthcoming book is all about people who, because of their faith, resisted racism and white supremacy. And you find yourself among this great cloud of witnesses, and you can gain strength and encouragement to keep up the good fight today. So one aspect would be to study history. Another aspect would be build your own tables. A lot of my personal pain came from thinking that I had to get into the spaces where white people were in order to be legitimate and validated. And what I came to discover is they don't validate you. Jesus validates you, and you can build your own tables, by which I mean your own communities, your own institutions that are centered around Jesus and justice, and not trying to play catch up or fix something that wasn't in the DNA when those institutions or those spaces were created in the first place.
Do you think that's a common dynamic among Christians of color in the U.S. where there's the feeling that you have to be accepted at the white Christian table, for validity?
Yes, because one is material and one is ideological. Materially, there's been a hoarding of resources. So if you want the building, if you want the full-time salary, if you want the conference with the fog machines and the lights and the LED displays, that's in white Christian spaces, right? Like by and large. And then the second is ideological, where what white supremacy is, if you just break that down, white means supreme. White means central. White means normal, normative, standard. And that's in the air. Even if you're black or a person of color, all of the messages that we get from birth are sort of centered around the elevation of whatever is deemed or considered white. And so you have this sense, whether in education or the church world or theologically, that what white people are doing or have said is the best way. And we have to actively work against that, including white people, to understand that it really takes a diversity and a plurality of perspectives to truly image God as God created, as God intended.
Have you been able, did you spend time diving into the African-American Christian tradition in the U.S. or non-white Christian traditions around the world to try to kind of break that lock of white supremacist Christianity?
Absolutely. The only time I heard James Cone, who's often referenced as the father of Black liberation theology, only time I heard him in my seminary was as an example of what not to do.
Yeah.
I explicitly remember it was a single lesson. We were studying the Pauline epistles, and we were looking at his interpretation versus some European white theologian. And the professor was pointing out how deficient these perspectives were that were coming from a racial lens, right? So I had to take it on myself to go and investigate these sources. And it took me years to actually figure out that that's what I needed to do, because I, again, had this idea that the right way of thinking about theology was what the European reformers were doing, or what these prominent pastors in the United States who were white were all saying and thinking and doing. So I did do that. And also, circling back to history, I learned a lot from our history. So many of our leaders in the Black freedom struggle, not just the civil rights movement going all the way back, many of them were pastors. Most of them were Christian. And so I had to analyze the events, the actions, the words, the speeches, the letters. How are they theologizing? How are they thinking about Jesus in terms of liberation and freedom and equality? And that has helped me reshape and reform my theological identity.
And do you feel going forward that one of your callings might be to help other people on that journey, to try to, I don't know what what are you going to write next? What's the next book that you're working on? It's a history of people who stood up for justice in the church?
Right. Yeah. I mean, you know how it can be really discouraging that we're still fighting this racism thing. And it seems like it's never going to go away. And you kind of want to give up sometimes, or just focus on something else. Well, I'm writing about the people who, under much more difficult circumstances, found a way to tap into what I call the spirit of justice and resist racism and white supremacy in their day. And I'm so excited. It was encouraging to me. And in the dedication, I just put in final revisions. In the dedication, I said, I dedicated it to all those who are weary and heavy laden. Be encouraged. And that's the hope and the point and the goal. So I talk about folks like Harriet Tubman, but not the Underground Railroad. I talk about her as a Union spy and leader in a battle where in one night she freed more enslaved people than in all her trips back and forth on the Underground Railroad. I talk about Anna Arnold Hedgeman. I have a whole chapter on women of the civil rights movement. I talk about Shirley Chisholm's faith. It's an incredible pantheon of people who are still Christian in the midst of incredible acute injustice. And they found a way to keep going, not in spite of their faith, but because of it.
What do you do when someone, picks one of those people and then points out flaws in their theology? Yeah, but this person believed this, or Martin Luther King wrote this once at Union Seminary. So, we got to throw them all away. What's your response?
I mean, we can quote scripture back at these folks where, I mean, in the Old Testament, God is saying your sacrifices are a stench to me because you are tolerating injustice, oftentimes injustice toward the poor. Where Jesus is more concerned not about what beliefs you're holding in your head, but how you're acting toward people with your heart and your actions. Like you just don't have a leg to stand on. And I want to encourage people. We often second guess ourselves on issues of justice. We're like, well, am I right? Is this something we should be focused on? When if you just go back to the Bible and there's a lot more evidence to back up our assertions that we should care about these issues and that we should care about people in marginalized and oppressed situations than there is anything against a sentiment like that. So we need to say it loudly. We need to say it proudly and boldly. Go back to Joshua 5, right? The angel of the Lord, are you for us or for our enemies? He said, no, but I am for the Lord. So what we need to do is get on God's side, which is the side of justice, and go forward in that confidence.
The side of justice and of not being woke, I've been told. Okay, so imagine, and this is the person I think about a lot. It's the person who grew up in the church, but they're now at the back door, wondering why I should stay. Just give me one good reason to stay. And it sounds like in some circumstances, particularly if it's a young Christian of color and they're in a primarily white environment where they just don't feel welcome, you might not advise to stay. You might say you'd be better somewhere else. So how do you know that person when they actually should leave and try, number one, when should they leave and try to find a Christian community that is better for their soul? And then secondly, how do they hang on to Jesus even if they have to walk away from a church?
Such a crucial question. I think a lot of people are right there right now. I have a whole section about this in my second book, How to Fight Racism, about when to leave. One of the signs that I think, I have this list of diagnostic questions. One of the signs I think is when it affects your physical health. There are a lot of people who, because of the stress of the situation, are getting sick, are experiencing insomnia, are overeating, over drinking. When it starts to affect your physical health, that is a red flashing light that something is off and you need to pay attention to it. So that's one sign. Another sign is if you have followed all of their stated procedures for a grievance procedure, you've contacted this person, you've taken this step, and they still haven't responded. Well, guess what? You did what they said you should do if there was a problem, and they have chosen to ignore it, downplay it, whatever it might be. That's a sign. So I do encourage people, okay, take the steps that they say, because you have to have integrity and say that you tried, right? But if you've tried and they've responded with gaslighting or minimizing or whatever it might be, that's another sign. I think another sign is you feel a distance from God. Like you almost get to the point where it's church or a nonprofit, just a community, you dread going there. And it depletes you, right? Mm-hmm. And then that starts to affect your relationship with God, where you don't want to engage in the things of the Lord, where you don't want to read the Bible or pray or even pay attention to that. Those are signs to leave. But that's leaving a particular community. Mm-hmm. That's not leaving Jesus, because Jesus hasn't left you. And that's what I try to do. You asked me before, what is my work or ministry or calling? I think that's part of it. I think it's really hard to share these stories publicly, and I'm grateful for the space to do that here. But I do that on purpose because I know there are other people who are feeling the way I felt and are looking for examples and patterns and principles that might help them. And so I share in the hopes that other people who are in that situation would find some crack of light that they can follow and keep going. And I would encourage you, this is not a Jesus problem. This is a people problem who say they follow Jesus and may not actually be following him. But there are people, here's the other thing I say. After the Hebrews cross the Red Sea, they don't immediately enter the Promised Land. they have to go through a wilderness wandering. And they're guided by a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. They don't know where they're going to camp next. They don't have a permanent home yet. But what they do have is God and each other. And so what I've found is that as I've exited certain Christian spaces, I've found other sojourners. I've found other wanderers. I've found kindred spirits that I never would have found if I had remained inside those walls of where I was so uncomfortable and experienced so much pain. So what I encourage people to do, there's folks out there and you just don't know it, and you'll never find them unless you exit.
Wow. Okay, last question. Jemar Tisby, in a nutshell. Why are you still a Christian?
I'm still a Christian because Jesus is so good. Y'all, it ain't complicated. I'm a Jesus addict in the best way. The more I get of him, the more I want. He's so sweet. He's so kind. He's stern when he needs to be because I'm hard-headed. And he puts me in situations I personally wouldn't choose. But it's for my good. And I can genuinely say that the more I have done what Joshua 1:9 says, be strong and courageous. And then there's a promise attached, for I will be with you wherever you go. The more I've attempted to be strong and courageous in these situations of injustice, the closer I've found that Jesus is right at hand, that promise of I will be with you wherever you go, he means it. It's true. And we cannot know that just cognitively. We cannot just reason ourselves to that. We have to act in faith, and then we can experience it. And once you do, there's no going back. There's nothing better.
But what if your penal substitutionary atonement theory is off by 12 degrees? Is Jesus still close to you, Jemar?
Oh, so close. Yes.
So close. Oh, man, I really appreciate you, buddy. Thank you so much, Jemar Tisby. Does your next book have a name?
The Spirit of Justice, Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance.
Ooh, is that later this year or is it next year?
That's going to be coming up in 2024. You will hear plenty about it if you follow
We'll
me.
we'll have you back on. We'll have you back on to talk about it. Okay, thank you, Jemar. And enjoy your day where you are.
Thank you.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Production assistance by Mike Strelo. Editing by Area Code Audio. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by subscribing to Holy Post Plus at holypost.com/plus. Also, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.